Hello, I'm Alex.
And I'm Kaylee.
And I'm Nina.
Alright, so we're going to be talking about the second third of our book, Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach. So this section consisted of 4 chapters, and I'm going to be covering the first 2, and they're going to discuss the next 2. The first chapter that we talked about, or the first chapter that you read, was about the use of cadavers in plane crash research. Not necessarily the use of cadavers, but it's more how the bodies that are found after plane crashes are used to kind of determine like a lot of like the causes, what happened during the plane crash and stuff like that. So it specifically discussed one plane, I believe, which was the wrong chapter. Okay, the TWA Flight 800, which was like the first example that they brought up, which was like the main thing they focused on this chapter. And in this plane, it was a plane that had crashed and nobody knew how it crashed. It just mysteriously kind of like disappeared. And they couldn't find the black box or much of the wreckage from the plane. So all they really had was like the floating bodies from the people that were in the crash. And so they had to use these cadavers as like evidence to determine how the plane crashed.
What kind of signs do they use to determine what happened?
To determine what happened to the plane?
Yeah.
They used a variety of different like techniques. I remember first of all they talked about how they examine not only wreckage from the plane they can discover, but they discover that in correlation with the bodies. For example, one of the things they proposed might have happened to the plane was that there was some sort of like explosion or like something had like combusted inside the plane that caused it to break apart or something like that. And so what they did was they examined the any like remnants of fire or like burns on the passengers of the plane and also the remnants of the plane they found. And this actually turned out to be the correct theory because when they looked at the passengers, they had burns mostly on the front, but not in the back because it was protected by the seats, and they did not find like much burn damage to the seats themselves, which is one of like the main things they used to find out that it was some sort of internal failure that caused an explosion with fire. But they also were able to refute or to like shoot down different things that might have happened to the plane by examining like chemical burns to see if they had any chemical burns. And yeah, after they discussed Flight 800, they continue to go into a few different examples, including talking about people that are like falling from planes and how to see if they can survive. They kind of carried it more into that kind of section, and they talked about like the damage, the internal damage, the external damage that you can see if someone's fallen from a great height and hit either water or land, and trying to find if people can survive from that kind of stuff. And in conclusion, they usually don't. And Roach discusses how they use like guinea pigs, for example, and they dropped them into the water to kind of relate the internal damage that they had from the internal damage from people. And they did this to discover if people died from hitting the water and they had to endure like a 3-minute fall from the plane, or if they died when the plane collapsed or whatever happened in midair. So that's basically the first chapter, and she continues on into chapter 7, The Cadaver Who Joined the Army. This chapter talks about like bullet and bombs or ballistics research and how they use cadavers in this. And this chapter I actually thought was one of the most interesting in the book so far. Just because it was interesting to see all the like the different types of research that they'd done with ballistics and projectiles and stuff like that. One example that I found that was kind of interesting was the use of, it's called ballistics gelatin, I believe, and it's because they use it almost to replace or to not use cadavers, because some people might find it kind of ethically wrong to shoot a dead body as they're already dead. It's kind of messed up. So they use the closest substitute they can find to human flesh, which is called ballistics gelatin, and they would shoot into that, and that was a way that they could look at like internal damage or that would be caused by bullets, because over this chapter, they discuss a lot of different types of research with guns and bullets in particular, and trying to find different types of bullets that they can use to either kill people faster or to even not kill people, because a lot of the research that people were focusing on a while back, before they realized this was very difficult to do, was if you could shoot somebody to immobilize them, like in war, but not kill them, because it would reduce the amount of lives that were taken, obviously. So those are the main things that I took from this chapter. Of course, they go into a lot of different detail about different guns, different types of ammunition that they use, and their effects on the body, and how they use cadavers to discover this. What did you guys think of these two chapters?
Well, I found them both very interesting, how they use dead bodies not only to help save lives, but as well as kill them. And that's mainly why they found them unethical, of why use these dead bodies to work towards killing someone versus trying to save them.
Yeah, I agree. I think their discussion of the moral ramifications and how they could solve these things by use of different weapons were really interesting, but it was, in my opinion, not my favorite chapter. I thought that other more chapters relating to the actual dead bodies and all of their all of the processes that they go through were more interesting.
Yeah, I personally, like I said, I found this chapter more interesting, which is, of course, based more on my personal interest, and which I just found it kind of interesting because I also used to watch a TV show where they actually use ballistic gelatin, so I kind of was able to relate that, and then so I was that made it kind of interesting for me. And also, one thing that I found really weird about this chapter is they discussed in using animals, because they used animals for research to make it less immoral to shoot humans. They use animal research, and I found it really kind of weird what kind of animals have similar organs as us.
Yeah, goats and pigs generally.
Goat lungs and pig brains or something like that. It was weird how.
Wasn't baby cows were also one of them that were really accurate, exactly 18 months though.
Yeah, that I found interesting. They had to be at this exact age that the cow was, so they would have similar components of the human systems, which was kind of weird to me. So that's just another thing that I noticed about the chapter.
Okay, so the next chapter is called Holy Cadaver, and it talks about how cadavers were used to research the cloth that had been used on Jesus to find how he died, if the cloth was even real. And so there was a French doctor, Pierre Babet, and he researched using cadavers. He would take limbs from his patients that he had cut off from them being sick, not the best condition, but he used them to. He was a very religious man, so he used them to prove that it was correct, but it was later disproved by a man, Frederick Zugebe, when he used real-life people. Some of the findings of, this would make him short-breathed, he'd want to lift up, or this is where he nailed Jesus, where Jesus was nailed at a certain place. This man in modern day, he used living people rather than cadavers to find out these sort of facts. And I found it quite interesting how living people want to be crucified. That's not something I would find. That's not something you would expect people want, but I found out how much there are religious fanatics out there.
Okay. And the next chapter, How to Know If You're Dead, takes on the debate over the definition of death and when exactly a person is dead. Historically, it was measured by if the person was breathing or not, but as time and modern technologies advanced, they found that brain-dead people were not technically alive, and so it also discusses the organ harvesting of a patient H who was only brain-dead but still breathing. I don't know. I found this chapter very interesting as well.
I thought it was kind of gruesome how they use the organs of somebody who's, while they were brain dead, so they're technically classified as dead, which is what they're talking about in this chapter. I still find it kind of unnerving that they will dissect somebody whose organs are still working.
But by this time, you also find out other ways that, like, your body decomposes. So it doesn't seem as disgusting to me by that time of, once you know okay, this is how your body can turn out. It makes me sort of want, okay, this is something better that can be used.
I agree with that, but again, the issue that I took with it, and the issue that it discussed a lot in this chapter, was the fact that patient H, she's brain dead, and that's part of the debate. Like, if you're brain dead but your body's still working, are you really dead? And they also talked, I remember, about something with a condition, I believe, in which your nervous system almost completely shuts down, but you're still aware of what's going on. And they talked about concerns of people back in the day. Obviously, they have technology. We can see if that's happening now. Back in the day, they were worried, would people dissect somebody with that condition and they're aware of what's happening to them? And that kind of especially led me on a path like...
Yeah, and like one of the things I found most interesting was how one of the ways they would test if they were still alive and breathing is they would like just like blast loud noises in their ear to see if they would wake up, or like stick a hot poker in I forgot exactly what he called it, but basically just their lower regions to see if they would wake up.
I also know they like pulled on their tongue. They just tried to induce pain or shock and or try and see if they would wake up. But this chapter also focused on like where is the soul, and previous conceptions of where the soul was. It was originally thought it's either in the heart or the liver, which is actually quite confusing because our society is so based on the heart being for love and all this, and then you realize it could have been the liver.
Yeah, I specifically remember there was one thing that I thought was kind of funny. And this kind of relates back to what we talked about last time, where Roach still provides kind of like a sense of humor for all this kind of gory stuff that's going on. In one footnote, I believe it was, she talked about, let me see if I can find it. She said, while discussing the whole liver situation and how it would be weird, you know, if the liver was like the heart or where the soul was. And she said somewhere, let me see if I can find it. Okay. Alright, yeah, it says, we are fortunate that this is so. This meaning the fact that the heart is what we regard kind of now is where the soul is. Or you would have otherwise been faced with Celine Dion singing My Liver Belongs to You, which I thought was kind of funny.
Yeah.
And it kind of showed me how even though, and she places this in a footnote, which is kind of interesting, because she's still focusing on a more serious topic, but she's still able to provide this kind of comic relief.
And they eventually get to knowing that the brain is where most of our intelligence and what distinguishes us from other animals comes from. So now it's more of the heart versus brain, more than heart versus liver.
Right.
Yeah, and that's definitely like a very interesting debate that's been going on. Is so many different people of like different cultures have had different opinions over the years. So.
And like this issue is still going on today. Like just in like 2005, you know, the most famous brain dead case of Terry Sheep. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Do you guys know?
I do not.
Okay. Not sure. Just go.
Well, you know, she was the most famous brain dead case. I mean, she was in a vegetative state, and it got the whole like country to rally around her and like argue of whether or not she was actually alive or dead, and whether she should be killed or not. You know, taken off her IV.
Yeah, there was a lot of interesting things about that, the definition of brain dead. I remember one section where they talked about a court case where the defendant actually argued that he technically didn't kill the person that he shot because their organs were actually taken out while their heart was still pumping, but their brain was dead. And that was the argument for the killer, that he didn't kill them, the organ harvester did. Of course, eventually they decided, you know, that the killer did commit the murder because brain dead is considered dead. But that was just another thing that I found was really weird, how something so like seemingly unrelated to this kind of topic can be tied into it. So you guys have reviews that you saw. What did you find out there?
So I looked at a few reviews before deciding on the two we needed to use for our assignment, and there was reviews more so intended towards librarians and people wanting, if they choosing whether or not they wanted to read the book, rather than people who had already read the book, analyzing what had gone on. So they were more so like less personable, like they were more objective, but they still painted the author in like a good way, like praising her for the book, of allowing people to find like all these facts in one book instead of having to research it themselves. And so one of the reviews I decided on had a mix of it's intended towards people that are have already read the book, and it has both the good and the bad. It critiques her for certain for like her use of language, because what I found with some of the reviews is the critics don't really like her humor. Something that we've agreed on, oh yeah, this makes the book easier to read. They don't really like it. They want it to be more scientific, but they also award her for bringing awareness to these sort of topics when it's becoming more prominent in the world, which I found quite interesting, that they don't like some of the things we like.
I mean, it's understandable, as we're totally different people from those who are researching and us who are just reading it, right? As a more like less biased kind of audience, we're just reading it, going in with an open mind. But I do, like I said, I do think it's necessary, just because this book is a very successful book, and I feel like it would not have gotten to where it is if it didn't have that kind of element, because a lot of people would be put off with just an overload of facts, you know.
And the second review was from The Guardian, and one of the quotes was just, actually, I think it has something to do with the style. Roach writes for Salon and Wired, and it shows excellent first-hand reportage and meticulous documentation, but also a massive educational factoids gleaned from the internet and secondary sources. Plus, worst of all, endless failed attempts to lighten things up with a little facetious humor of the Bryson variety. And it just shows like how little these reviews think of her style and of her humor. They think that it's just making it easier to read, which isn't something that she should have aimed to do. She should have aimed for a more scientific approach, as Kaylee said.
Yeah, so I think the overall consensus for the reviews is that it's more towards like a casual reader, not someone that's into like the scientific specifics, because while these are a lot of random facts, a lot of people don't know them, versus somebody in the study would just be like, that's something everyone knows.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to look at these different perspectives, because I personally, when I saw these reviews, was kind of like surprised at that, because I thought that her kind of like humor and almost like lighthearted sense that she applies is kind of one of the things that I thought was the best about this book. And it is, like, even reading the reviews on the back of the book, people who have reviewed the book like how she's able to be a little more lighthearted and to make it important, factual, but also kind of interesting. So I thought it was very peculiar that these reviews would find her take on this book to be so...
Right.
Yeah.
You know, like, I personally enjoy, like, hearing all of these stories and finding out, like, historical examples of human cadavers in the past and what they were used for and how they helped benefit modern technology and advancements. But the humor helped aid me along the way, and probably was the thing that kept me reading it besides these stories. You know, like, her writing style is very unique and something I don't experience a lot in nonfiction books.
Yeah, exactly. I myself am not a very big nonfiction reader, so the fact that there was this kind of enlightening kind of like humorous element, that made it one of the things that kind of kept me reading the book. So is that all you guys have for like the reviews and stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So overall, just what did you guys think about this section? Because I'm just curious.
Do you want to start?
All right, I mean, I guess I can. Like I said, I was more inclined to like the more not scientific, but more like the real life kind of applications with things that I can like already relate to. Like obviously I can't relate to or have no experience reading about dead bodies or handling dead bodies. or like embalming, like it talked about in the last chapter. Like
Yeah.
that is definitely nothing that I would have ever looked up just for fun or for whatever by myself. But when it's talking about the chapters, like in the last one, it was talking about crash tests, and in this one, it talked about like the studies of plane crashes, and the studies of ballistics and projectiles and whatnot, and even the section about religion I found was kind of interesting because those were topics that I was a little more familiar with, and that helped me like identify a little bit more, like I know some stuff. Like I said, like I'd watched a show where they talked about something that she mentioned, like the ballistic show or whatever, so I was able to kind of be like, oh yeah, like I know that, which I hadn't really been able to do with some parts of the book beforehand.
Yeah.
So that made this section to me a little more interesting.
So some sections of the book are more for you and less for you, like depending on the topic.
Yeah, like I mean, even I'm still, despite what I thought going into this book, I still am kind of intrigued about like the.
It's growing on you.
I don't want to say it's growing on me, but it's I'm able to read it without thinking like, oh my gosh, this is gross. I'm able to just kind of read it and just like take in the information. And I remember reading the last chapter about, or chapter 9 or 8. Which one was it?
Well, 8 was in our section, 2nd, 3rd.
Yeah, then 8.
Yeah.
the one where they were talking about, in the end they discussed like heart transplants.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I was talking to you about earlier was how they discussed all these studies about these people who got heart transplants and almost like felt like a connection with the person that had the heart before, and that was interesting to me, but also weirded me out like a lot.
But they were also wrong a lot, which is something that I found interesting, that maybe it's a psychological thing of, oh, I have someone else's heart in me, I must have things like them, but then they tell the person that gave them the transplant the sort of visions they're having, and they are completely wrong.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, and from what I could see, but still just reading about it, how people have these like just changes in behavior, like people, I remember there was one person who had said the person who had donated them was gay or something like that, and they said they like immediately started dressing more like feminine. I thought that was just crazy how you can have like a change just out of the blue, and these people are thinking like, oh, the reason this is happening to me is because of the transplant. Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of weird. But then also, like she said, I remember one mention of a person who was very specifically stating that they felt that they had visions of then being a black woman eating French fries or something like that in a car crash, and it turned out to be like an elderly white man or something, which is the person that donated to them. So it definitely seems to me like psychological. Like these people might just, obviously they're overwhelmed, going through a lot, having such a like big dramatic change, but it was still kind of weird to me.
So I actually kind of went in the reverse direction at first for some reason with this section, because I went into this book really curious, like, okay, I haven't read anything like this, I don't know anything about this, because I've generally avoided it, because
It's gross.
you want to live without thinking about the end of what you're doing. And so I went into this really curious, figuring out like what it was, and then so when I started reading it again, for some reason the nausea of just reading some parts was hitting me more than the decomposition of bodies, which I found really peculiar that I could go from one day really liking the book to struggling to read it the next. So I think it's something that it depends on how you are that day, or if you're into her humor that day, because sometimes it's a on or off thing. But I eventually got back into it because, once again, I spent my entire life in a Catholic school, so seeing how religious people can get with knowing the general really religious people was kind of insane to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. What about you? What did you think?
Well, I had almost a complete opposite of you. I admit that, the constant juggle of trying to incorporate her humor and, digest it in, daily life is kind of hard to do, especially if you're not in the mood for it. But, some of these chapters, the ones that he mentioned, Beyond the Black Box, when they were talking about the passengers, I just couldn't get into it. I felt like it was such a bore to read.
Really?
Yeah, I was just...
Really?
Yeah, I felt
I found the animal part interesting, but I struggled at first.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I got into it because then it started talking about, like, dissecting the dead bodies, and that's the kind of stuff I'm into. Like, getting into the actual, like, scientific facts instead of just, like, hearing about these people, going into a crash and being like, oh, what happened? And, like, chapter 6 was really fun because, like, getting to figure out, like, moral ramifications and, like, thinking about what my moral ramifications would be if I was in that situation. Like, I thought that was interesting, but chapter 7, I couldn't get into at all. Yeah.
Chapter 7.
You can't relate to it.
No, like, I'm not religious at all.
Okay, that makes
and
sense.
my family is kind of religious, but they went through a religious change, They went from being Hindus to Christians. So it's not like, it was in my lifetime, and I'm not, like, too keen on the religious thing. I don't really believe in it too much. Sure, it was, like, interesting in some bits, but at least that chapter was short. But 8 was probably my favorite chapter, like, how to know if you're dead, and talking about the soul, and, like, oh, are you really dead if you're brain dead? And, like, can we do organ transplants on you, or can't we? Like, what should we do? And, like, how the ICU doctors and nurses felt after doing that, and how they had to have, like, therapy, and sometimes that was really interesting to read. And, like, I'm really looking forward to the next few chapters because I read the titles and I am ready. Yeah.
For the next one, we'll see what happens
Yep.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to go back to what you said about how I don't remember. It was one of you guys. I remember you were talking about how, like, they provided. It was a while ago. How they provided, like, the historical examples, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were talking about, like, how they went back to, like, the location of the soul or whatever, like the debate over, like, where's the soul in the body.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of interesting how they were able to connect it to, like, different cultures. Like, it was like the Babylonians were the first to, like, think that it was the liver, and then the heart.
Was it Greek?
Greek?
I believe it was
I think
Greek.
I was thinking Greek as well. And how all these different cultures had all these, like, different views, and it kind of makes me just think, like, about, like, science in general, like how far we've come to people thinking that your soul was in your liver, or even it talked about briefly about, like, William Harvey, and all these other, like, scientists or people focusing on anatomy from that time, and, like, how wrong they were. It's, like, crazy. Like, some of the things that they thought were just you're just looking at it now and you're just like, what? that makes no sense. But obviously that's because we've been brought up learning all these things about the human body with all this, like, new technology and all this new information we have. So yeah, I just thought it was kind of interesting how we know so much more than we used to about this kind of stuff.
Right, and just one tidbit about the Greeks and their beliefs in the soul and, human bodies. They believed that when humans were first brought onto this earth and, like, created, that it was actually two humans connected to each other, like, by hip, and they had 4 arms and everything still, but instead they were, like, attached and adjoined on the side. And so that's actually where the, like, famous heart symbol, like, this comes from, because obviously a real heart doesn't look like that, but the famous heart symbol comes from 2 hearts sewn together, and it actually comes from the Greek.
It's interesting. I actually noticed she used the heart symbol, like, in the book a couple times.
Yeah.
Like,
Because it was like for like bumper stickers, they were just like,
yeah.
imagine if that was a liver.
Yeah, that's what it was. I was gonna say, I remember bringing something up about that.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of, like, sparked my memory a little bit.
Right.
So, is that all you guys, like?
Well, I actually am curious about. We've talked about the moral, like, the dilemma of, is brain dead, or is it when your heart stops? Like, when are you actually dead? Where do you think you stand on that?
I don't know, actually. I feel like I wouldn't be able to decide, because personally, like, I felt like if it was, like, my sister or somebody that I really loved on that table, and she was brain dead and everything, I wouldn't want her to, like, die, and I wouldn't want to stop seeing her, but at the same time, like, seeing her, like, brain dead, and not being able to function or think about things, I don't know what I would do.
I like to think of it more logically of, if they're brain dead and they're not using it,
Yeah.
someone else can live with using
Right.
those organs. I like to think of it that way of, it helps create the brain dead is helping others.
But I constantly struggle with my heart versus my brain, so, like, it's just, I personally wouldn't be able to decide, but if I'm looking at it from a standpoint, I'd be like, sure, harvest their organs, it's fine.
Yeah, that was actually what I found intriguing, kind of, I guess, is what they brought up, because they kind of brought up what you said exactly, and what you said as well. The opinions on it is they some people, because the family has to give consent for a dead person, because obviously they can't speak for themselves. So they have to give consent to have any operations done on them, and it said that like over 50% of the people said no to harvesting their organs. Because, just for some people, like you said, it's just hard because that person, you don't think of them as a body that's providing organs. You think of them, like a family member, somebody who's close to you, like a person. And I think your standpoint was a little bit more like, logical standpoint, like, oh, this is a person, they have organs, and they can be used. So I think it just kind of depends on your, like, stance between your, like, emotional and then your logical side of things.
That actually kind of goes back to the very beginning when she discussed cadavers of, you need to take that standpoint of you can't see them as people, otherwise you can't really work on them.
Right. But going back to what you said about their families having to decide because they can't decide, there's actually such a thing as a living will, where you can decide, like, what happens to your body if you're brain dead. Would you want your organs to be harvested or not? Like, obviously their organ donor card is, like, a thing, but a living will testament provides more specific details on what you want done.
Yeah, and that's just, like, one of, like, the many things that, from reading this book, you can expand into, like, so many more topics because it's discussed such a wide variety of topics already. Right. I mean, we've gone from planes to embalming to guns and then back to religion. Like, they just go over so many topics. I think it's kind of interesting. You can bring up, like, so many different viewpoints like we did. But I think we have to wrap it up at this point.
Yeah.
Do you guys have anything that you just wanted to say before we finish?
I think overall with the reviews and what we've found in ourselves is there's a little bit of something for everyone in this book. Not everything is for everyone, but you can always find something, it seems, in here that you can relate to.
Right?
Yeah, I agree, because obviously as we all pretty much had different kind of things that we liked, different like viewpoints on it, so it kind of shows that. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I had some very specific prejudices against, like, the the 5th and the 7th chapter, because they were too boring for me. But, I feel like with her humor and with her sense of writing, as well as all of the facts and stories that are being told, whether historical or her own that she's experienced, there's, as she said, something for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, that's really kind of way that she's able to tie it all kind of together. So many different people with different viewpoints and stuff like that can read this book and enjoy it. So.
All right.
I think that's all we have for today.
Bye.
We have to turn off.